We've been talking in class about a new time period for our country. After the Civil War and Reconstruction was over, our country then entered a new age, a modern age that emerged the United States as a world leader. There were many changes that took place as people moved out west in migrating to new farms and mines. And with those successes, the Industrial Revolution was able to happen, which was a total change in the kind of economy that we had. This attracted many newcomers to our country, and so waves and waves of immigrants from Europe and Asia came across the oceans to start a new life here in America. So with all of these changes, with new people coming over by the millions, with our economy changing and more resources to use, there were a lot of good things about our country at this time period. There's a lot of progress made. However, there was a lot of problems as well. So that's what we're looking at here in this recording. We've looked at the different problems of the cities, both activities that we did in class, like the brochure, and with the video that you saw, the America Story of Us episode. With many immigrants coming over into the cities, there was a lot of overcrowding that took place, a lot of issues related to that, such as prostitution, violence, drug addictions, murders. There were just constant problems with crime. And the way that the tenements were constructed, which is where the immigrants mostly crowded into, there was constant danger of fire because of the way that they were constructed and the fact that there was very little means to put out a fire. There was a lot of unsanitary conditions with waste being thrown into the streets. There was no sewage lines yet. And so because of this, people caught diseases very easily, such as cholera and typhoid fever. So these were definitely problems that needed to be addressed. In African American areas of cities, the problems were even worse than in immigrant areas, the European immigrants and the Asian immigrants. With some of these problems in the cities, it fostered the rise of political corruption. Politicians who wanted to get elected for different positions used the crime and the problems of the cities as ways to promise the people certain things in order to get support to get elected. These politicians did have the authority to give relief to the cities that were suffering, but mostly their motives were to get profit for themselves. So politicians, they would make these promises to these lower class immigrants that they could help them get better buildings to live in or whatever it might be, or that they would lower the crime rate, and then they would get voted in. And then at the same time, the politicians would then work with businesses who were growing because of the Industrial Revolution and try to rip people off and the cities off of taxpayer money to line their own pockets with. This is something called political machines, and it's something that you looked at in the brochure as well. It's the idea that a politician would have people working for him to form this sort of organization. They would go around and get support and promise things to people. They would win the elections, and then they would decide who would do certain jobs for the cities. And these businesses would charge more than what was necessary, and then the business and the politician would share the profits. So this is definitely evidence of economic disorder. We talked about with the Industrial Revolution, there were certain businesses that were getting extremely rich, and a lot of that was done at the cost of the people who worked for them. We talked about people like Carnegie and Rockefeller, how they were able to expand their businesses with techniques like vertical and horizontal integration. This led to mega corporations that dominated an entire industry. We saw a modern day example of that when we watched the Luxottica film. And the idea of one company controlling the entire market is something that started during the Industrial Revolution. Sometimes consumers could benefit from this because there were often lower prices with certain industries being controlled by one business, but many times the workers were being ripped off because they weren't paid enough and they could never really get a decent living for themselves. During this time period, though, there was a growing middle class, people that weren't super rich like Carnegie and Rockefeller, but were able to get positions in certain businesses that allowed them to make money to live decently. They had decent homes, and they were able to get by in a way that was sufficient. These were mostly, like you can see mentioned here, jobs such as managers of stores, clerks, small business owners, college professors, lawyers, church leaders. These were all considered middle class types of jobs. So these people could afford the new goods that were being produced in the factories, unlike some of the lower class workers. However, the middle class, they always kind of felt trapped in the middle because they knew that the wealthy could take advantage of them, and the lower class that was growing in number could get to the point of absolute desperation and then start to revolt. So with all of these problems, socially, with the cities being extended to their limits, and crime and massive amounts of people pouring in, economic issues like the wealthy companies becoming wealthier and wealthier at the expense of the workers, there was this idea of a movement to change things, and it was called the progressive movement. And it's the idea that middle class people could take action and institute reforms so that their positions were not threatened. So you can see the reasons for it here. The elites are the wealthy class, and the trusts were these huge corporations that they would organize. It's kind of what we think of as a monopoly. These things threatened small businesses, which is what mostly the middle class consisted of. The lower class, often called the working class, were always dealing with crime and poverty, and because of that, they were vulnerable at any moment to just explode with radical ideas and anarchy. So the middle class, they wanted a return to traditional values that you can see here. They felt that if the wealthy people were kind of restricted with how wealthy they could get, and if the lower class were somewhat guarded and given some changes that would benefit them, that the middle class could see their position secured. Some of the ideals that the progressives had, you can see listed here. Jane Addams was someone that you put on your brochure. She was the lady who started the settlement house movement in Chicago, and her establishment was called Hull House. Basically, her idea was to provide services for the poor, giving education to the children, medical care, food, clothing, anything that could help them in these settlement houses. And oftentimes the immigrants would live in the settlement houses, or at least they would go there during the day to get the necessary help that they needed. That would get the lower class the help that they needed, so they wouldn't start to rise up and revolt. So the progressive movement is pretty similar to when we talked about the populist movement with the farmers when they were getting ripped off by the railroad companies and they organized their own political party. But that was more of a lower class movement because the farmers were extremely poor. This is more of a middle class movement. So their ultimate goal was to get these two groups, the wealthy class and the working class, under control so that there would be more order and stability in the cities. The middle class wanted to focus on people who had studied these problems in depth and could be considered experts, and they could come up with solutions to the problems that were being faced by America. The cornerstone of this progressive movement was that democracy, the idea of the people selecting their leaders and determining what laws would be made, would be essential to making the real changes that were necessary for our country. So because of this idea that the experts needed to be consulted, there was a growth in college enrollment. More people were wanting to go to college to be able to come up with solutions to the problems, especially in certain types of departments, what we call the social sciences. These would be subjects like political science, psychology, sociology, and history. There was more people that enrolled in these programs so that they could have the knowledge necessary to come up with solutions. Lester Warden is an example of an intellectual who came up with ideas of how to fix some of the problems of the cities. These intellectuals felt like it was the government's job. You know, we elect people to make laws for us. They're the ones that need to take responsibility for the way that the society was going and to fix some of the problems. We looked at examples of muckrakers with the brochure and with the homework assignment from the jungle. Muckrakers were writers who wanted to expose a lot of the problems that were happening to get people outraged at businesses, at meat packing plants, whatever it might be. They researched these issues and then they wrote about them in books or newspaper articles or magazine articles, and they were able to expose some of the problems. In the video, you saw Jacob Riis's book of how he took pictures of tenements, and his book was called How the Other Half Lives, to show the conditions that immigrants were living in. Lincoln Steffens was someone that was in your brochure. He wrote about a lot of the political corruption with these politicians promising things and then making these deals with businesses to rip off the taxpayers and to control the votes so that people got voted into office when they really didn't have the votes. It was all about fraud. So these are examples of muckrakers. Upton Sinclair was the guy who wrote The Jungle, and he showed how nasty it was in the meatpacking plants. So thankfully, we have laws now to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Also, there was religious reformers that took movement, and we mentioned the settlement houses. A lot of that included Bible training to the poor to get them to look to Christianity as a solution to their problems. The social gospel movement is a part of that. It's the idea that Christians have a responsibility to improve society. So they combined religious teachings with the problems that were going on to try to come up with a solution. Walter Rauschenbusch was a famous preacher during this time who basically told Christians that it was their job to try to come up with solutions. So in the previous screen, we looked at the analysts, which were people who went to college, studied the problems, wrote about the problems. But now let's look at some of the activists, which were people who wanted to take specific action to fix the problems of society. Women were some of the biggest progressive activists, and a lot of this was because of child labor, with women being mothers of children who were working in coal mines or dangerous factories. There was a growing number of women who wanted to force the government to make laws to end child labor. Florence Kelley was one of the biggest of those. She helped start something called the National Consumers League, which is the idea of consumers boycotting certain businesses that used child labor or used any type of unsafe working conditions, and to boycott those products so that the business would lose money and they would be forced to change their methods. Boycotting is a very successful tactic that's been used all across history. The National Consumers League also supported the settlement house movement that Jane Addams started, and she obviously was a woman as well. So women and the idea of working together by peaceful means of boycotting and to provide education were some of the ways that things got fixed during the progressive movement. African Americans were some of the biggest progressive activists as well. They had even worse problems than some of the immigrants because of the racial aspect of it. They were viewed as not as good workers, lazier, less intelligent, more likely to do something bad. Lynching was something that was going on ever since Reconstruction with the white terror groups such as the KKK. It was still continuing to this time period, not just in the South, but also in the North. There were some people that tried to stop this. A lady by the name of Ida B. Wells, she wrote about the different statistics of lynching that some people had no idea was going on. And then a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois led something called the Niagara Movement that demanded equal rights, and he was kind of like an early form of a Malcolm X. He helped to start the NAACP and the National Urban League to pressure employers and labor unions and the government to make laws to outlaw lynching and to improve black status in society. Another man by the name of Booker T. Washington was influential for African Americans. He took a more gradual, peaceful approach. He was like an early form of a Martin Luther King, and like I said, Du Bois was more of an early form of a Malcolm X in demanding rights immediately and using violence if necessary to secure their rights. So these two gentlemen kind of were the early civil rights activists of our country. Let's take a look at some of the agendas that were brought up during the progressive movement. Sometimes it focused on political reform and making the government take action to destroy these corrupt politicians and the political machines. And in some cases, there were some specific steps taken of how this was achieved. City governments were changed to make it more efficient and smaller. The type of people that served in governments was addressed. So rather than just business leaders and big politicians, it was more the people who were in the small businesses who understood the problems that they were trying to vote in. They were trying to cut government spending so that these businesses couldn't get these huge contracts anymore, and that the way the elections were conducted so that there was less of a chance of fraud. In Wisconsin, there was a very famous governor named Robert La Follette, and he's extremely famous as a politician because he was an honest politician, which is hard to find both today and back then. He refused to take bribes and cooperate with corrupt politicians. He actually instituted a series of reforms in his state of Wisconsin that you can see here that directly brought about change in the kinds of people that were elected, and the idea of people getting to introduce ideas for laws, and the idea for people to remove people in office that they didn't feel were very effective. It also paved the way for the 17th Amendment to our Constitution, where people directly elect U.S. senators, not the state legislatures. The idea of women and African Americans, again, focusing on their rights to vote. Women hadn't had the right to vote yet. African Americans did after the Civil War, but they were restricted so much with the Jim Crow laws and the black codes that they pretty much did not have the right to vote. So these two groups of people you can see here led efforts to try to get that fixed. Finally, there were some presidents that were influential in making changes. Teddy Roosevelt, he's a famous president. He definitely had the idea of breaking up big companies and regulating railroads, protecting the consumers, and conserving our national parks. And then we have William Taft, who kind of went along with some of Teddy Roosevelt's ideas. And then finally, Woodrow Wilson, who was the leader of our country during World War I as well.